We're good? You can just edit early parts out
Yeah.
if you know how to do that.
Yeah, we can cut it.
Okay.
Your shoulder is out.
Am I better? All right.
All right, well, welcome to the first of what we would consider many of digging through history.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm Anthony, this is Jim, and we're really going to kind of just walk you through and dig up some of the not so talked about historical topics, or maybe things that are
Maybe more things behind the things that are talked about. Because most of the things we talk about are probably going to be familiar, at least the terms.
Yeah, that's true.
And we're going to talk about the stuff that shows up behind them that doesn't get front page play.
There you go. So the first topic we're really going to dive into is looking at, well, part one of two in terms of slavery. Of course, it's a big topic that is in the news all throughout, and especially with the recent protests and increase in mentality of the American and world society of just how do you deal with the word slavery?
What does it mean?
What is it? Where did it come from? Things along those lines. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and just dive into
All
history of slavery.
right. Well, at its base, it's the idea of chattel slavery is ownership of another person by somebody else, usually for the means of labor, and really, if you stretch the term of labor, that fits all cases. But throughout history, you're going to see the terms change. There isn't a whole lot of difference between a slave and a serf in the Middle Ages, especially if you start talking like Russian serfdom, except it's like a one-step removed slavery. The nobles own the land and the serf belongs to the land. So the noble doesn't technically own the serf, but he owns the land that the serf belongs to. So really you don't see a whole lot of difference. And when you see throughout the Middle Ages how nobles treated their serfs and how slave owners treated slaves, you're not going to see a huge difference. Well, at both ends of the spectrum, the ultimately cruel and those that were, more benign. But slavery was everywhere, with some rare exceptions.
Right. And that's what we're mostly going to be focused on today, just trying to figure out where it was taking place. Taking all the way back to what? The
BCs.
Right. and moving all into the ADs and the different types of societies and how they dealt with this slavery issue. I mean, of course, the first major civilization to own, or at least work with slaves, would be what, the Mesopotamians, or even before?
Well, really, you look at all the river civilizations.
Right.
They all had slavery in some form or another. Some were more, like the Egyptians, a little bit more legalistic about it, and it was a little bit more temporary. Mm-hmm. Chinese and Indus River, a little bit more social status. Babylonian, I shouldn't say Babylonian, Mesopotamian, really ends up with a whole lot of different styles, but a lot of it based on warfare, because you have all those little city-states constantly beating each other up. So what do you do with your captives? You turn them into slaves, make them do labor, which I think is probably the best point to make old world slavery, to differentiate from New World slavery, which is much more based on color.
Right.
Whereas Old World is more based on situation, I guess. Typically reserved for captives of war,
Debtors.
debtors, criminals. People that you can't really say they got themselves into that situation because if you're a prisoner of war, you really didn't probably choose it for the average person. But it was situational, and it was usually not inherited. If you were a slave and you had children, they weren't considered property of the master. Now they might end up becoming servants, maybe even considered slaves to the household, depending on the arrangements. You see that biblically. The idea that a slave could get their freedom and then choose to stay a servant, a member of the household, which of course, begs the question, why would anybody ever do that? Isn't freedom the best thing ever? I mean, as 21st century Americans, we'd like to say yes. Cue your Mel Gibson Braveheart moment. Freedom! But there's a lot of truth to the freedoms, or another word for nothing left to lose. When you live in these, especially the ancient times, in the ancient Near East, that's the one I'm the most familiar with, you live in a very anarchic situation with a lot of violence. Being part of a household that cared for you and watched out for you, even if you weren't a member of the hierarchy of that family or clan, if they still treated you well, it might be very beneficial to stay in a state of servitude, although that might be a stretch to call it truly slavery because it's voluntary. But the result, servant, slave, hard to differentiate in ancient texts.
Of course, and when it comes to, like we had mentioned, the harshness of the environment. I mean, if you're living in Ur or Uruk in Mesopotamia and you're having to fend for yourself, what would you rather be? In a group that is going to help protect you, maybe a noble or at least a landed individual, or go out into the desert and try and survive on your own against the Assyrians or the Chaldeans or any of the other groups that are going to try and get you,
Once in decades somebody shows up,
of course.
The farmers always bore the brunt because they're the ones outside the city walls. And
right.
If there was no warning, there was the one to take it. But it really boils down to pre-industrial revolution, slavery is an economical thing. It's purely based on economics. Yes, obviously there were people who used slaves for other reasons, but when you really get down to it, Caesar's household or a rich man's household, what did these slaves do? Had the guy at the basement working the fan so that everybody could stay cool. Had the people washing dishes, cooking, chopping firewood. In essence, they were doing with physical labor, because that was the only way to do it. There was no mechanical change. That was how you got a household that looked like a modern American household, where you have a dishwasher and the water comes right through the pipe. If you want to look at it mechanically, we have slaves all over our homes because, we use machines to do the same thing. Somebody who was wealthy in 200 AD only can do that with people.
Right.
And which, of course, you see the variability because there's no check or balance. There's no police force making sure you treat your slaves well. No labor union.
no, labor unions were not even in existence. And
what, the closest one is Spartacus? And that didn't work out well.
Yeah, well, yes, of course. I am Spartacus. No, I am Spartacus.
Yes.
Yeah. What, 300 of those individuals were killed and crucified? And yeah. I don't think that worked out well.
No, but because there's nothing like this, if you have a good master, someone who takes care of you, they treat your family right, allow you to marry and have children, and they're part of the household as well, you could see a great deal of loyalty be given to it. And you see it occasionally in movies.
Right.
Where there's a household person who is a slave who's very loyal to their master because he's treated very well. And he can also look out and see, not just for his fellow slaves, if he ever even saw them as fellows, because remember, this is much more individualistic. It's not, in most places, you see it a little bit more in the Indian subcontinent, the caste system kind of creates them and leaves them there. But most other places, a slave could become free, but they look around and the regular people are hand to mouth. Yep, they got their own farm for now,
Right.
until there's a drought or a famine or locusts,
Any-
and suddenly
anything.
you're broke again.
Right.
And you're looking at, well, maybe my eldest daughter would be better off as a slave, so we could eat for the other 5 of us could eat for the rest of the year.
And that just really brings in the question, what different societies dealt with these slaves, thinking about it, like if you're an Arab trader or even an Arab caliph and you're coming into North Africa, how is that going to look? You have these North Africans who are used to being on their own, they're independent, and then what do you have? You've got Arab traders coming in from Saudi Arabia or Yemen or wherever they may have come from, and they overtake.
Well, and then we go back to the prisoner of war.
Right.
People have always, as far as I can tell from history, been spoils of war.
Right.
We look at biblically in the book of Judges. Jericho falls. They put it to the sword, but the animals and everybody they left alive was considered theirs. And again, at Ai and other battles, or sieges, I should say, they take everything that they want, and that's the norm. We shouldn't really see the biblical text as any different than a history text from Hammurabi, who would say the same thing. If he takes a fellow city-state, the people are his to dispose of as he wishes.
And that's the same way when it came into the Greeks.
Oh, yeah.
The Greeks did
very
a
much.
large number of that, prisoner of war, taking what they wanted and using however they felt. I mean, think about it. If you were an educated individual in, say, Corinth or any other major city-state, and your area was taken over, well, what was your ultimate job? You were a tutor.
Yeah.
Tutor for the wealthy, tutor for the leading caste of citizens. So maybe you were a general's tutor to his son, or, well, not his daughter, because of course she would get
she doesn't
educated.
get educated.
But
What are you trying to do here?
are we trying to be socialists here? No, not going to happen there. But I mean, think about it. Even with the Greeks, and then of course, what do the Greeks give us? The Romans, and how they, even though the Romans were first, we know. The Romans do the same kind of thing. They take over in, say, where? Greece. Once they took over Greece, what happened?
Yeah.
They became citizens in a way, but were ultimately the slaves in that system of the Republic, and then eventually the Empire. But it even goes into the biblical sense. When the Romans took over in Judea, well, they were pretty much slaves to the society.
Yeah, well, you had the 3 layers. You had citizens, who were rare, especially in places like Judea.
Well, of course.
And then you had subjects, who was pretty much everybody else.
Yeah.
And then below them are the slaves, the people that they were either captured or criminals or whatever, that were sentenced to slavery to pay their debt. Which, I mean, of course, the big one is the salt mines.
Of course.
Which salt mining is dangerous, nasty work, kind of like coal mining. The odds of surviving 5 years in a salt mine, even with good ancient healthcare,
Right.
is probably close to a death sentence.
Yeah.
Same thing with the rowers in the navies. Athens was kind of strange, and they used citizens. That was a big thing for them,
No.
to not allow, if you were rowing, you were a citizen, which is, a different take. I mean, and we see that craziness with, the development of democracy in Athens. At the same time, they have slavery, and they don't see a,
Negative effect?
they don't see anything hypocritical about that.
Ah, I see.
They don't consider that hypocritical at all, because they don't see slaves as a permanent slavery, the big term, is a permanent institution, but you as a slave may not be a slave 5 years from now.
Right.
You may eventually become a citizen of Athens and be voting with everybody else.
Which
which would be unheard of in a lot of other places that we talk about.
Yeah, I mean,
well, most of the Near East,
right.
biblical,
Well,
not a
and-
lot of citizenry going on.
Well, and
Egypt.
even with the caste system, you got to think about it. In the subcontinent of India,
Mm-hmm.
you were born into that,
Yes,
And-
you never changed,
right?
which is the really, as far as I can read, the exception to the rule.
Right.
Most other places, slavery was a temporary you only situation.
Right.
And
And
children would move on. But again, with no checks and balances,
sure.
you could have the bestest master on the planet who
Mhm.
just treats you like, it's every day is Christmas.
Yeah.
But you don't have any idea what his son's going to do, or his uncle, or whoever takes over after he
Sure.
dies.
Sure.
So you have no stability, generationally speaking, or worse yet, if you're a young person who's taken into slavery and the master is old and kindly, and then he croaks and son's not so much.
Right.
Well, guess what? You're still a slave.
Exactly.
You
And
don't have any choices in the matter. Which, of course, is where, as we head towards more modern times, becomes a lot of the thinking as we talk about, the rights of the common man and
Right.
seeing people as something than other, which is another one of those things that probably we should discuss.
Yeah.
Well, just the idea that, let's take the British Isles, for lack of a better term. We have Irish, we have Welsh, we have Britons, we have the Angles and the Saxons and the Danes and the Scots. We have all these groups who all saw each other as other, as less than them. So the idea of using a captured opponent as a slave, just not even, you don't even give it a thought.
Right.
They're less than. This is what they deserve because you conquered them.
Right.
And that continues. It's really, we have, when we look to bring it, I guess, forward, when we look at our problems today with race, we have grown as a species pretty impressively from the time that the people over the next hill are less than. I mean, we bemoan the fact of our race relations in America and really worldwide, but when you look at the growth from even 1,000 years ago, where literally people living on the same small island all hated each other and treated each other as less than, we've moved forward. It's hard to see when buildings are burning and people are rioting and arguments are going on around everywhere, but there's been progress and it's hopeful. And Ronald Reagan said, all we need is a good alien invasion. We'd immediately forget about race and we'd think we're human.
Right.
And then, of course, 2,000 years hence, we'd be having this conversation about people being racist against Alpha Centaurians and people like that. But it's growth. It's hard to see when we're into it. We're down here in the weeds with it. But when we look back, who was a slave in the Roman Empire? Anybody they could get their hands on.
Right.
But again, that's Gibbons talked about that as the possibility of one of the downfalls of the Roman Empire. They quit expanding. They didn't have this free supply of slaves, and they didn't have the mentality or the mechanism to make it permanent for people.
Sure. When you give these, well, for the lack of a better term, barbarians who had gone to the edge of your empire the ability to become citizens and not be that slave that you were hoping to control and keep over a period of years, what are you left with? You're left with people who are non-Roman citizens.
Mm-hmm. Well, and how do you explain that when you're a senator's family?
Right.
And you have a family that are slaves/servants for your family, and literally for generations into the myths of history, they have been alongside you in this experiment of Rome. And then, Hans comes down the road with his buttered beard.
Right.
And he's a citizen. How do you look at this guy is more Roman than that guy will ever be?
Yeah.
And you could see where it would cause all sorts of consternation in the Roman Empire of how do we, but again, they didn't, servants very often stayed servants. Just in a lot of places today, one of the great things about modernity is the concept that we can change our social class.
Sure.
We don't like the fact that it goes both ways.
Yeah.
You know, hopefully everybody's moving up, but that doesn't seem like it's always going to be the case. They didn't really have that. When you look at the wealth distribution, that's a big phrase that's come out recently, of course, too, in all discussions about minimum wage and the wealth gap and CEOs. When you look at the wealth that the less than 1% controlled in ancient times, we look at it like a crazy democracy because we have a whole lot more wealth in the bottom 20%
Sure.
than the bottom 20% has ever had. Doesn't mean there aren't grievances and all that good stuff that we could talk about in a later episode when we talk about labor and socialism and all
Yep.
these other cool things. But the world didn't change. There wasn't wealth generation like we have today. Nobody was suddenly going to set up a Facebook and make billions of dollars where they just hadn't existed before. Facebook didn't take money from somebody else. It generated a whole new industry.
Right. And that really does bring into an account of how just society has changed and the way, again, of slavery. I mean, if you think about it, the earliest of individuals, even down into the continent of Africa, and thinking, oh, people always want to associate the idea of slavery is blacks and whites. Well, and like we've mentioned in the beginning, this old world style of slavery, it was not just blacks and whites.
No.
It was whites and whites. It was blacks being the owners and whites being the slaves. I mean, think about it. Many African cultures, the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, they brought people from Europe and brought them down to Africa as working as slaves because they had the better groups. Of course, the Mali, the Songhai, the Ghana, they came in after the fall of Rome in the West.
Yeah, right.
So, they're in kind of a big...
I don't know how much contact they had either.
They probably didn't have much, but...
Big, ugly desert in a way.
Yeah, but you also got to think about, when the Arab traders come into North Africa, and of course they're used to that big, nasty desert, they start spreading into Iberian Peninsula, what is now Spain.
Right.
They start taking people from Europe and they start bringing them down into North Africa, which then spreads into the rest of Africa. So the idea of slavery is not just...
It's not what we consider racially based.
Right. It was, again, like we mentioned before, economics.
Right.
Economically based style of slavery.
If a king wants to do something great, he needs cheap labor.
Right.
And slavery is the cheapest of the labor. Although I'm not sure. Another episode. I'm not sure sharecropping wasn't the cheapest of labor.
Well,
but in its easiest sense, how do you build a pyramid? You need cheap labor, and
right.
You either get it by taxing your citizens with labor,
right.
which we see again in the Middle Ages, with people giving labor to their lord in exchange for protection, and blah blah blah. But it's not racially based at all because when the English will move into Ireland, they take prisoners and they take slaves. They're not black.
No.
They're not brown. They're pasty white with maybe red hair.
Yeah, like me.
Yeah. We both have a lot of Irish.
So he would more than likely be the one that would be taking over me, but we're not going to go into detail on
only
that.
This half, I mean. and then I grab this half. And
Yeah, well, I kind of go this half, and I'm the one who's probably putting myself into slavery, but whatever. But again, it's not this understanding that the big bad white guy is going to take this poor innocent black individual and put them into slavery. It's the big bad white guy is going to take the other bad white guy and put them together, and there you go.
And again, there's brief periods of time where you see different civilizations, although it might be a stretch.
Yes.
Dynasties might almost
Sure.
be a better word. In Persia, you see it. They have no legal chattel slavery, but they have very similar laws to serfdom. where the lower classes basically don't have a choice. And it really comes down to it, lower classes always are limited in their choices economically. Starve or work.
Right.
And that hasn't really changed as much as we'd like to have dressed it up with labor laws and minimum wage laws. It still comes down to the fact that if you really want to survive, you have to be willing to work. And usually at jobs that nobody else wants to do. That's always the case. I mean, the first thing you do when you get money is you don't do the jobs you don't like.
Exactly.
You get somebody else to do it. That's why I have somebody mow my lawn.
Mm-hmm. Or there's people working in garbage removal.
Right.
Exactly,
And the nice thing about our system is it allows entrepreneurs. People start their own lawn business and suddenly they're doing 10 lawns and they're hiring more people. And suddenly it's not a servant's job. It's
you're the master in a way.
Literally, you're the one that has the crews and things, and you're a capitalist.
Right.
Which is something, of course, when we once again bringing this back to old world slavery, doesn't occur. Capitalism, while it was probably the form of a lot of things, people knew if you had a good and somebody else wanted it, you could sell it.
Sure.
And if you had a lot of it, it wasn't worth as much.
No.
Or if they wanted a lot, it was worth more.
Right.
But till the 1800s, land was considered one of the most important properties you could ever have because everything came from land.
Sure.
Timber, ore, food, all came from ownership of land. And of course, you have to have somebody to get those things for you if you have land.
Well, and think about it this way too. If you can always trust land ownership. You can't always trust what a factory is going to do.
Well, yeah.
You can't always trust what an economic system is going to do in a roundabout way. Because it always takes us back to what? Trade.
Mm-hmm.
In even wrapping it into slavery. When you're trading a person, in a way, trading a person for product or land or whatever the case is,
gold or whatever you're getting out of it.
It's all a part of the economic system.
Mm-hmm.
And we can even bring that into, I hate to say it, New World style of slavery, where, of course, that's probably what we're going to cover next time. But the idea of trading a person for something else is, again...
It's not some wild idea that popped up in 1619.
No. This has been going on for
millennia.
Millennia, exactly. They've done it forever, for every civilization too.
Yes, like I said, there's some exceptions, but they're either very tiny, especially hunter gatherer.
Sure.
Where cheap labor doesn't really mean as much because you need skilled labor.
Yes.
Anybody can, harvest wheat. Really.
Right.
If they can swing a scythe or they can sheath it up.
Sure.
Or thresh it. That's cheap. That's cheap, easy labor. But yeah, a hunter, you have to have some skill.
Mm-hmm.
Last thing you want is some guy who doesn't want to be out there hunting, making noise.
or
right. Throwing a spear into your back.
Right.
Which is another tendency of civilizations. They don't typically arm their slaves.
Right, of course.
Not until the Ottomans.
Yeah.
When we see the Janissaries, who are a system of taking Christian children as slaves and training them up to be administrators and soldiers, which is probably the most, I don't want to say factory-based, but it's just such a very almost industrialized procedure for producing more slaves.
Yeah.
These people were always considered subjects, so therefore ripe for harvest, for lack of a better term. And then the Janissaries, for all intents and purposes, towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, well, from 1400 on, Janissaries really become one of the dominant forces in the Ottoman Empire, which is strange because they prop it up for 400 years.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that they are literally culled out of the lowest of the low as far as the Ottomans are concerned and made into the administrators and soldiers. It's
a real success story in a way.
I guess if you don't look at the end,
hide
your eyes from the very end.
Yeah, put your blinders on
before the sick man of Europe.
Yeah, well, that's again a story for another day. But But again, where do you really see any civilization that's going to arm their slave?
Well, it just seems like a bad idea.
I mean-
Generally, if you treat your slaves bad and they have weapons, it doesn't last long.
I mean, just think about that. Look, like Spartacus. Granted, he was not armed, but he led the revolt that ultimately ended badly for him.
But as a gladiator,
Yeah.
of course, he was trained to fight,
right,
which makes that situation so unique. It's why the story of Spartacus has lived on and on, despite the fact that it ended very poorly.
Sure.
Didn't change a thing.
no,
In fact, it probably made it worse for the slaves of the Roman Republic. Mm-hmm. Was it still a republic then?
it was probably the empire by then.
It was
But
a Republican empire.
yeah, there you go, Star Wars.
Yes, a Star Wars kind of thing. But I mean, again, bringing it into modern times, it's why our founding fathers were very adamant about the Second Amendment.
Of course.
If the population isn't armed, the government determines what happens, period.
Yeah,
And they had no trust in government. Not being taken over by people who did not have the common weal in mind. And so you have literally, I think it's probably the first place it was ever enshrined, that the population should be armed for the specific purpose of protecting the country and not just from invaders.
sure,
That's-
but from themselves in a way.
You can't make somebody who's armed a slave unless they're willing to do it.
No,
Which,
you're right.
again, goes back to that whole point. You don't arm slaves,
Right.
with the Ottomans being a weird exception.
And of course, they're always kind of an exception to the rule. aren't
They do have quite a few exceptions to their
Yes.
rules, even if you just put your feet up. But as we talk about slavery, the biggest things I think to take out from old world slavery, of course, is it's not race based; it's other based.
Right.
Preferably, but that other could literally be the guy down the street who gambled on the races.
Yeah.
The Circus Maximus and lost, and now he's a slave.
Right.
Or he's had to sell his son into slavery to pay off the family debt.
Of course.
We see that in Northern Europe. I guess the Scots, it was almost a perennial activity that slave traders would go up to Scotland because it's such a poor country, so hard to raise crops there because it's rocky.
Yeah.
Growing things on rocks is hard.
Yep.
And people would purchase slaves from families because it was the only way to keep the family going for another year, to be able to buy wheat or oats or whatever you could get a hold on to feed your family. But it wasn't. We specifically want Scots.
No.
It was, we need cheap labor, and we're going to go where we know we can get it.
Right.
Where are there poor people? Where are there people that have been destroyed by warfare? But by it's probably somewhere around the Crusades time, the church really starts, the Catholic Church and the Western Christendom starts putting wanting to put the brakes on Christian owning Christian, based on the book of Philemon and several other places that we'll talk about again.
Yep.
When we talk about American slavery.
Yep.
But we have most Europeans had quit enslaving at least other Europeans. Not so much in the Balkans, which they're almost, again, like the Ottomans,
Yeah,
an exception. But notice they're neighbors.
Yes, of course.
They're another exception to some of the rules. But we see them getting rid of slavery. Serfdom's almost gone by the 1400s, except in Russia,
yeah, well,
where it
Russia
lasted until
again
1900s.
Yeah, because that's Russia.
But then again, Russia sits astride Asia and Europe, and kind of like in the same way as Poland sitting between Russia and Germany.
Yeah.
It just never works out well for them.
No.
I don't even want to imagine what doing Ancestry there is like. Trying to do Ancestry.com stuff. Oof.
Yeah.
The different strains that are all mixed in because of invasions going both directions forever. But again, not other, or is other. How we see those others has changed over the years, and then it gets solidified in the New World as race. But not speaking of American slavery in particular, but there are more slaves today than there ever has been in the history of man.
in a world that, technically speaking, is made slavery illegal in every country. But it doesn't work out that way. There's several African countries that practice slavery. There have been reports that even Saudi Arabia has slavery, wink, wink, not really. So it's still going on, and it's still, no. You shouldn't take by our concept that it's a economic, non-racial thing in the old world to say that it's a good thing.
No,
it's just not. It's very hard to see the advancement of civilization without that cheap labor of slavery. I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day.
No.
But it was built by slaves.
Yes.
Well, maybe not the roads.
Yeah,
Well,
probably
at least not all
roads.
of them anyway.
Right.
Legionnaires got a lot of that job.
Yeah.
But again, what were they? They literally had to sign a 20-year deal. But it ended with citizenship.
And a plot of land.
And a plot of land. So you were a knight almost, if
Right.
you look at it, Middle Ages talk. But 20 years, again, with ancient medical technology and a lot of people trying to put sharp, pointy things into you.
Because they don't want Rome to be there.
Right.
You were literally, there were people effectively selling themselves into indentured servitude, which is about as close as you come to slavery in a volunteer basis.
Right.
For a long period of time. But economics is what drove slavery for centuries, well, millennia. The need to have cheap labor to do stuff you don't want to do, and the only way to get it done is a person. Later we start seeing animals take over some of those jobs, but not on the massive scale you would need, and not on the scale you see until the 1840s and 50s, when the Industrial Revolution really starts moving along, and we get a whole bunch of new ideas about freedom. Because if we're not tied to those machines, although you can see historically that Industrial Revolution didn't solve the issue of slavery. We just talked about that. They're
Right.
still there today.
Right.
But usually not for the economic reasons of pure labor. They're usually involved as status symbols of servants
Yes.
or sex slaves.
That's again a story for a whole
Yeah.
other episode.
Yes, and again, when you look at it, historically speaking, there's no protections for slaves. The only protection is the wisdom and the kindness of their master.
Of course.
If he wants to beat them, well, guess what? Unless they're strong enough to run away, there isn't anything.
Good luck.
Again, biblically, the Old Testament puts limitations on what you're supposed to do to a slave, but there are very different rules about if you do damage to a slave versus doing damage to a regular person, so to speak.
Hammurabi put that into his code of law.
Exactly.
And
All those are in the 1000 plus BC time frame. Hammurabi, the Old Testament. Rome and Greece are later, but they're still in that next century. They have kind of the same thing. There's good ideas of what you should do with slaves, but in practice, there wasn't anything to stop you
Right.
from doing whatever you wanted, which to me is the most repulsive part of the entire system. We can look and we can talk about those exceptions, those people that were treated well, and like the Janissaries, other than being the castrated part. That didn't seem nice.
Well,
I'll pass.
thank you.
But you see them promoted and put in positions of authority and even almost rulership in a lot of ways. But those are exceptions to the vast majority of slaves over the course of human history. Most slaves lived horrible lives where they had no freedom and probably as little joy as they could get out of their lives, which maybe, in some cases, marriage, children, those things, but that was the limit of their world. There wasn't anything bigger. And if their master decided he was going on a trip to Jerusalem from Rome, well, guess what? Your family just got split up because you're his servant and she's just a kitchen help. So, boom.
See you later.
And you have nothing to say about it. And to me, that's the most repulsive, is you lack any ability to make your own decisions or chart your own destiny.
And unfortunately, you don't see your modern understanding of even really a retirement system, or
Oh, yeah.
even for a noble, you don't really have much of a retirement system. You don't see anything along those lines. That again,
You're at the mercy of your children.
right, and that's this whole system of us thinking in terms of 20th and 21st century, well, really later 20th century,
Yeah, later 20th century. Yes.
early 20th, first century mentality, and putting that into 16th, 17th, 18th century, and even before that, slavery or just life in general, we have to keep in mind, we can't look at it through a 21st century lens.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to a 21st century lens.
No.
I mean, it really just doesn't. It's like
No.
looking into a kaleidoscope that's on a hamster wheel.
Exactly.
Just
It's just
spinning
completely
constantly.
going every which way.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense because we don't see ourselves as people who would own people, which I think is a good thing.
Of course.
I think that's a very good thing.
Yes.
But when we look at it, if you watched iRobot or things like those kind of movies,
Right.
we have slaves all over the place. I have a machine that will turn on my other machine so I can cook dinner.
Exactly.
I have a machine that washes the dishes for me. If it would put them away too, I'd really appreciate it.
that would be
I'm
nice.
waiting for Rosie from the Jetsons.
Yes.
But I mean, we need that labor so we can do the things we want to do. We can because if everybody boils down to, I have to do my own cooking, my own cleaning, my own chopping wood. Take it back to a first century concept. If I have to do absolutely everything for myself, I have a very limited capability of doing anything greater than just survive.
Right.
And that's the push of civilization. The great thing about the modern world, for all of its flaws, is that the number of people who can pursue their hobbies, their dreams, their whatever, outside of their work is an amazing change in history that I don't think we appreciate enough. When we look back to even the 19th century, we look at, Little House on the Prairie kind of times,
yes.
where we think of that idealistic, it was simpler then. Yes, it was, but you worked from dawn till dusk and you did nothing else except for one day a week you went into town to go to church, and maybe you went in twice because you had to go to the merchant once a month to get, the things you couldn't make on your own. But your life was literally work.
Right. Well, and even think about it. Even though we're in this 21st century style of life and having those quote unquote machine slaves, we're capable of doing the things that we're doing right now.
Right now.
Exactly. Using the camera that we have behind us or in front of us and sharing with our hobby.
Right.
Being a history nerds that we
Yes.
are and geeking out and sharing it with you. And hopefully you guys feel the same way of sticking with us.
Yeah, I hope you get some entertainment value out of it. If you have questions, of course, I don't know where all we're going to post this.
Oh yes,
But
we'll
please feel free to send comments, questions. If you're really, if you don't like my face, don't bother to tell me that. But if you have some constructive criticism, we'll be glad. We're just starting out on this little adventure, and it's going to be kind of fun, I think. And we're gonna learn a lot. Hopefully, as we go, we'll learn some stuff, and you'll get more than just looking at the two of us. Get some ways to put some maps and things into the mix, and you'll get more. But for right now, we just love to talk about history. We don't really need the maps and the books. But again, the time to read those books, the time to go to the schooling, all comes from the fact that we have machines that do all that work.
right.
We have, and yes, you can say, well, there are people working in those factories and stuff, but they get such a multiplier on their labor compared to somebody in 500 BC working in Athens, who is cutting wood all day. Imagine how much more wood he can cut with a chainsaw,
Right. Or pressing the olives to make the oil by hand, comparative to
Or
having
feet.
right or feet, feet for that matter, I guess so. But having a hydraulic press or
well, yeah, where you turn this thing. That's
Even-
18th century technology, but suddenly you can do 3 or 4 bushels of olives in a single afternoon, as opposed to
maybe
one bushel a day.
Right. Right.
Your return on investment for your labor goes so far up that allows you to do things like, well, watch us.
Yes.
As our photographer servant transmits this to our electronic scribe who'll
Yes.
save it and record it for us. I mean, we already have 2 people just working, not to mention the lights. And,
Right.
You know, all the things that
Everything.
are going. It's, to me, when I study things like, you know, slavery, doesn't matter, old world, new world, just an appreciation that we don't live in a world where that's necessary.
Right.
That's the beauty of our society. You know, again, we have problems, we have things we'd like to fix, but when we look back at history, we're living in a golden age that we don't even recognize.
Exactly.
Probably because we're too full from the golden arches.
Exactly.
Oh boy! You know, well, that one place that we've just now seen machines take over
Uh-huh.
the productivity
Right.
in fast food. Right?
Exactly.
All these things connect to today. Even when we think, oh, that's, you know, ancient Greece or Indonesia or wherever we're talking about with slavery, you know, it all comes to today. What are we looking at a world? Because our needs haven't changed. You know, we need food, shelter, warmth, and we just don't provide them the same way anymore. Okay, probably Indonesia, they didn't allow warmth.
Yeah.
But you still needed fire to cook.
Right.
And maybe cool every once in a while would be nice. But so we want things that are just basic to us, and if we can provide those, what more can we do? And if we don't spend our time getting those things, what more can we do with ourselves? It's an endless discussion, really. It can always come back to, you know, what is a person worth? And for so much of history, the answer has always been, what can I get out of them?
Exactly.
And you know, I'm not sure we've changed a great deal,
Right.
but we're definitely more humane about it. Even in the worst case scenarios that we read about today with minimum wage jobs and things, compared to our ancient ancestors, even the ones who were the owners,
Exactly.
their lives are so much better because they have free time.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they choose, they could get a second job with that free time and build up wealth and capital to do something new. Maybe to buy that new servant that gets them back and forth from A to B.
Mm-hmm. Or helping their children
Or
to
helping
where
their
they
children.
are not having to do the same.
Yeah. The American dream.
Exactly.
I don't think it's purely American, but it's a dream.
No, it's definitely a dream that many, many cultures share, even to today.
Yep. It is us.
So anyway, I think that's a good place for us to stop.
I think so.
And hopefully you all will enjoy this, and we will see you next time.